Welcome to Now Needs Next, Better IEPs for our students with complex needs. So today we're going to talk about IEPs, but maybe not exactly in the way that you expected. When thinking about the webinar for today, I didn't really want to show you slide after slide of laws and definitions, basically repeating the same information that you could find in lots of other places. I thought instead about what I could share about IEPs that might be unique to my experience. In my capacity as a statewide augmentative communication consultant for over 20 years, I have read many IEPs, typically about 50 every year. In that time, I have developed a process that I use for evaluating the quality of those IEPs based on both required legal elements as well as some more intangible elements. I typically use that process pretty informally. I just apply it in my head as I read through the IEP, but I also do use it with teams and have turned it into a format that I can share with others, and they can use it to create and evaluate their IEPs. So today I thought I would share that with you. I really want to shift the focus to the content and the process of the IEP as opposed to just the format of those words on the page. So we have just under an hour to take our next steps towards that better IEP. I want you to feel good about the IEP as a product, not just because it complies with the legal requirements, but because it is a strong reference point for information about instruction and for progress monitoring. So today we're going to cover three main areas. First, I'm going to take you through that planning process for evaluating and creating IEPs. Next, I will focus on some specific ways that you can improve the narrative or present levels section of your IEP. And then lastly, we will look at features of high quality goals. So whether you're a parent or an educator, by the end of the hour, I hope that you have a better idea of what makes a good IEP, where yours stands relative to that, and have some actionable next steps. I do want to direct your attention to the handouts, which are linked with this webinar. They contain all of the forms and the examples from the webinar, as well as a number of additional resources. I would also like to share with you a tremendous resource on the topic of IEPs by Barbara Bateman. This book literally reshaped my own thinking about IEPs, and you will see her influence reflected throughout this presentation. Her non-IEP form is very much the basis of the process that I use today, so I want to recognize that. Okay, let's get started with a little summary of my process. I call it Now Needs Next, not just because I love alliteration, which I do, but because it simply describes the process of writing the IEP. So you can kind of see at a glance the now, needs, and next components. The two pieces that are at the bottom, consider and conclude, we're really not going to address those today. They deal with some of the questions about transition and extended school year and assistive technology and placement. So we're just going to talk about the top three areas. Okay, here's a couple of sentences that will just give you a broad introduction to the Now Needs Next process before we actually get into the chart. We start by looking at the now, identifying the strengths and abilities, challenges, concerns, and impacts in foundational, academic, and functional skill areas. We then specify educational needs, and finally we plan for next steps and how we will address all those needs through accommodations/support services and goals. That's just a simple overview of this process. Okay, Now Needs Next planning chart. Don't panic. Look at this. You do have it in your handout. I just wanted you to see kind of what it looked like. It's a single page in the form of a chart. And again, if you check out your resource link, you'll find it there. I do think that it is critical. You can sort of adjust this process as you go. making tweaks in terms of how you record information, etc. I hope you understand as we go through sort of what's critical to keep as is and what you can adjust. But one of the things I think is critical for the planning stages is this chart format. I think it is critical to the success of the process because when you have a chart, you have very discrete locations for information. You can see the big picture of all of the elements you need, right? So I can see at this level all of the different spaces where I can potentially put information. You can see once you start entering information what's there, and maybe more importantly, you can see what's missing. The other thing you do is notice relationships and patterns between the different sections. And when we get to some examples of this chart in the completed form, you'll be able to understand that a little better. But I think having it in a narrative form is really one of the disadvantages of the present levels section of the IEP, because it's not easy to see what's there and what isn't like it is here. Okay. So let's start with the column 1, and we're going to work our way across the columns, discussing what goes in each column and how we know that. So that first column, if you noticed, and you can see a little bit here, has been filled in. The content is a list of specific skill and ability areas. You have both foundational skills, which are also called developmental skills, such as vision, hearing, communication, and motor. And you also have academic areas like literacy and math and content subjects. Just to note that I prefer the term foundational skills for 2 reasons. One is it takes the focus off of the term developmental, which can be a slippery slope for our students with significant challenges. And it also points out that these are the areas that form the foundation of learning and education. So we need vision and hearing and communication and memory and all of those things in order to demonstrate performance in those academic areas. So the items that you see in that first column, or that are listed there, are going to be the reference points for the entire IEP. These areas represent the breadth of content that you're going to discuss in all of the subsequent sections. So I want you to really think about that for a second. If you looked at your student's IEP right now, would you see all of the areas, and I'll go back here, would you see all of those areas discussed in the narrative section? Because you should, particularly for a student with significant needs, you should see all of these discussed. And how do we know that? Well, let's look and see. The law really tells us so. So here's one slide. The IEP team must consider the academic, developmental, and functional needs of the child. And it also references academic achievement, referring to the child's performance in academic areas, which include reading and language arts and math and science and history, etc. So I'm not sure if that information about what constitutes academic and foundational areas is new, or if that's known to you already, but I do want to say that this is probably one of the most significant problems I see with IEPs, is that we do not start with these areas of reference as reference points. So it's important enough, I'm going to say it again. One of the #1 problems with the present levels of performance, which then manifests in everything that comes after that, is that we are not explicitly referencing all of the areas that we should. And that's a big purpose of this form, is to explicitly say, did you talk about this area? Did you talk about this area? Did you talk about this area? The second problem that I see in IEPs related to this first column is that the academic areas are not specific to the grade level general education curriculum. We should be referencing the academic skills expected for that child's grade and class, not for a lower grade, not based on a developmental continuum, the curriculum for the grade that corresponds with the student's age and in that school. So It's really beyond the scope of today to expand on how a child with significant challenges is measured against grade level standards, but that is the expectation of how it is to be done. And also, an important note is that it's how we end up with quality goals that are aligned both to the student and their abilities as well as to the standards. So if we don't start by referencing the grade level general education curriculum, it is very unlikely that we are going to end up with goals that are properly aligned to both the student and to those standards. So if you want an action step associated with this first column, grab your IEP and go through this list and check off every area that you see in the present level section. What areas, I'll go back again, do you see mentioned in those present levels? If you have areas that you look for and you don't find them, ask yourself why not. So the only acceptable answer to why you would not see one of these areas on your child's IEP is that if the child's disability has no impact on that area, that is, the area is completely unaffected by the disability, in which case it does not need to be part of the IEP. Otherwise, there absolutely should be a representation of every area that's written here in that child's IEP. So I'm just going to go back, to make sure that we're on the same page with what the general ed curriculum is. Again, this is not Maureen Nevers. This is IDEA saying the general ed curriculum is the same curriculum as those for non-disabled children. And also, this is in response to a question about, do we have different core subjects and standards for students that are functioning below grade level? And the response is, we're focused on high academic standards, and we're using the same standards as those for all children. So that's a clarification that we're on the same page. Okay, so let's move on to the next two columns, which are labeled the now. Okay, so the first column there in the now section is titled Strengths and Abilities, and the next one says Challenges. And they're both actually asking the same question. For each area in that first column, identify the student's current status. The difference between the two is that column 1 asks for the can-do statements, and then column 2 wants to know where and when the student encounters difficulties in that continuum of skills. So I want to refer back to the chart format and the significance of that. So in this case, I've broken information into separate sections, and where I do that, I do it because it's a meaningful separation. So what do I mean by that? If I were to combine information from different sections into one, I might be missing something, but I then couldn't see it from the chart, right? Because I've collapsed sections together. So in this case, I'm separating out the strengths and the challenges, and it's because I want to see at a glance that the team has entered content for both, which brings me to another common challenge: present levels of performance that are heavily weighted to the can't do or does not or challenges section. Right? So for every can't do statement, there is a can do statement connected to it. There is always a point along that continuum where we are. We just have to be purposeful about finding it and recording it. So because it's important, I want to not only ask for that piece of information, I really want to see at a glance if it is or is not there. Again, action step. For one of the areas listed in that first column, look and see if you can find both strengths and abilities as well as challenge statements for that. Okay, so let's just look at some of the law, and I'm not going to focus time much on this, but I want you to have access to this again to support, validate. So it's not what you know, but what you can prove. So this is information that you can use to prove that this is required, right? So this provides support. I also want to just communicate with you some information about functional performance, which is what we're going to talk about next in this section. So in this side, we have reference to twice to functional, and in the regulatory guidance, again, that Q&A, we have a definition of what functional performance is. So I'm going to go back to the now section because the last line in each of these boxes says what the student is able to do, including functional performance, okay? So let's talk about what that means. Functional performance is not one particular area, it's more of the application of skills in a particular context. So for instance, functional performance in literacy would be how the student does with all the non-academic parts of literacy. For example, I might reflect the fact that a student is unable to participate in group discussions with peers because they don't have a communication system. Or I might say that a child's vision impairment impacts their ability to access information on the smartboard across content areas. You can see that these are not academic skills, they are the areas that sort of surround the academic context. So in your Now Needs Next instruction document that's in the resources section, you have some examples of functional performance that might help you to see the pattern of the types of things that fall into this category. I also really like something called the School Function Assessment, which you can put into Google. It's a tool that is for purchase, but it evaluates the functional performance across all areas of a child's day, and they give you sort of examples and key questions, and I think it really helps to shape what it means for functional performance, because I will say that approximately 0% of people seem to get functional performance right. Most people interpret it as life skills. And while that's one part of functional performance, it's certainly not the only part. So action step, first check out those examples of functional performance in the handout, and then look at your IEP and see if you can find some that fit that criteria. Okay, we ready to move on? Let's get into the needs. Needs, this is our critical juncture for the IEP. This is where we answer the question, so what, about what we've written so far. In that first section, for the now, we describe the current picture of the child from the perspective of that continuum. Here's what they can do. Here's where they start to have challenges. What we do in the needs section is determine what impact, if any, those challenges have on the student's ability to be involved in or to participate in the general education curriculum and to make progress. So what we want to know is, what is the relevance or significance of the challenges that we've described? And what we want to do is determine, is this an educationally relevant need? So we have to look at those challenges and compare them to what's expected. Remember that first column of information, the curriculum. What are those educational expectations? What are the challenges? And are there some mismatches? We wouldn't assume that every challenge is results in an educational need. Many of them do, but we can't assume that they do, and we also, even if they do result in a need, we have to express what that is. We want to know, in what way does this have an impact, or is this a need? So here's why this is a critical juncture in the IEP. This column is a gatekeeper. So it's a gatekeeper between those present levels in the now column and then the supports and the goals and services in those in the columns to come. If you do not identify a need in an area, you cannot provide resources for that area, meaning accommodations or goals. So in other words, if you do not have a statement of impact or need in a particular row, you should not have an accommodation or service or a goal in that row either. You must have an educational need to move forward in that row on this chart or on the IEP, whatever format you're using. You cannot have something in the next quote column unless you've got something in the needs column in that same row. And it's not just a formal process. If you think about what this process means, it makes sense. Why would you be making accommodations or providing services if there wasn't a need? So sometimes what happens is we don't identify a need, we move on to the next step in the process, and we try and develop a goal that we think is necessary. And then we go, oh wait, if I really feel like this goal is necessary, maybe I missed a need here, and we realize that we have to go back and, oh, there was a need and I just didn't say it, and I didn't realize it until I found out that I wasn't allowed to, put supports in place because I hadn't expressed a need. It's critical. We're going to see in the next step when we talk about that section how this kind of pans out. But for now, action step, see if you can find language in your IEP that clearly identifies needs or impacts, and what areas do they cover? Where do you see those statements? And is that really all of the child's needs, or are there needs that are not identified or aren't clearly identified in the now section? Sometimes you'll see language like, oh, the child has used PECs. That isn't really a need statement. That is telling me something that has happened in the past, but I'm not sure if that means, is that over? Is that something they require now? What does that do for them? So sometimes it's ambiguous language that needs to be clarified in order to really clearly understand, that is something that they need, or there is an impact. Their communication impacts their ability to participate in the classroom, and so they have needs for supports around that. Okay, so let's look at the IDEA statements about needs. Here's one statement, and here's another statement. Again, you can read those and know that what we're doing is consistent with that. Okay, so now we're moving on at a good speed here with the next section. So it's our last step. And here again, you're only going to be able to work with the areas where you identified a need in the previous section. So in that previous column, if you were writing in notes or you were putting check marks to say, yes, there's a need, then those are the sections you're going to be dealing with for the next column. And what we're going to do is make our plan for addressing each and every one of the things that are listed in the needs column. First and foremost, we're going to try and address them through accommodations or modifications. So before we jump to setting goals, we're going to say, is there something that the adults can do or change or make available that would help to address this need? If there's anything that we can do to change the conditions so that that need is going to be either met or decreased, then we want to do that. We want to indicate yes, and we would put a check mark or we would write a note about what that's going to be. If you look here, think about this as adult change or changes in the learning environment. So back to our next column, let's look at the areas where you're going to develop goals. So you've gone through and you've determined all of the accommodation areas that you can support, right? So you've made those checks. Now you have potentially some needs that are still unmet. You would want to determine, okay, where do we want to designate a significant amount of time and energy to instruction that is going to result in, quote, child change to address this need. You don't necessarily need or want a goal for every skill that is left. You might want to combine those. So for instance, if I have needs around organization and maybe following routines, I might find one goal that addresses both of those. So it's not a one-to-one correspondence between every need needs a goal or every needs a separate need has a separate accommodation, but you do have to be able to draw a line from the need to what are you doing to address that. So again, you want to look for those patterns and themes and see if there's ways that you can combine those needs into discipline-free goals. I do have a couple of handouts that are going to help you not only with guiding questions for goals, but also one for related service providers that really guides them through how to contribute to the present levels in ways that you can use. So when you have a related service provider, like say a speech pathologist like myself, and I kind of go off and do my own eval and do my own thing, and I come into the IEP with my goals, it doesn't give us a chance to combine those ideas into common goals, and that's where you end up with this laundry list of goals. So I have a form that asks specific questions of the related service providers about the information I need for that now and the needs column, and then it doesn't allow for them to submit a goal statement. It requires that that is generated with other content, like in this process, so that we combine all of our input about the present levels and we use that to generate those discipline-free goals. So let's take a look at some of the information around goals. Again, IDEA information, educational needs. Also, here is some supplementary aids and services. I will say I am not clearly sticking to defining or differentiating between aids and services. I generally think about there are things we do for the child directly that kind of interface with them, providing them with adapted materials, etc. And then there are things we do for the adult that benefit the child, right? So all of those have different terms. I don't want to get bogged down on that. Suffice it to say that there are those types of supports that benefit, and all of those could be considered at this point in the process. So let's see the related. This is about services, and we'll talk about in a minute the fact that services and goals go hand in hand. So you cannot have a service or goals, and goals are a measure of a service. So if you have a goal, you have to have a service that goes with it. It doesn't have to be one service, but there has to be at least one service that is provided, because that goal again is child change. So how would we expect to have a change in the child if we don't provide a service of specialized instruction for them? Also, a little known fact that if you had no other goals on your IEP and you only had one goal, it would have to be an academic goal. So the one requirement is that you have to have an academically related goal, the at least one. So okay, so again, goals related. You can look at all of these. Okay, so the two big takeaways here from the next section are, one, the items only come from the needs column, and two, if you have a need, you must have an accommodation or a goal or both. You can't have an unmet educational need. Okay, and here we are with the whole process back together again. So let's just recap what we've accomplished here with use of this form. We have all of our academic skill areas here. We have our foundational or developmental skills represented. We're going to address our strengths and abilities. We're also going to talk about where the child encounters challenges. We're going to address functional performance. We're going to specify what the impact is of the challenges and indicate when they result in an educational need. We will then identify a range of accommodations and modifications to help support that. And then lastly, we're going to determine goals. So if you think about the terminology from your IEP, the Now Needs Next covers all of that. And what I like about this is, again, if we talk about process versus product or format, lots of times when we start writing the IEP, we get bogged down in this superficial terminology, and the content suffers. We're not saying anything. We're sort of talking in circles, and it's this narrative that has no substance to it. Whereas when you put the facts down in sort of brief form, it really, they have to stand on their own. So you can then take this information and plug it into any version of an IEP format that you want, and it would work. Okay, so here's an example of a chart, and quite honestly, this one is 6 years old. It's one of the first abridged charts that I did, but I wanted to show this to you because I wanted you to see that even though we took maybe a half an hour to walk through that process, I actually can use this with teams to create a draft IEP in 10 to 15 minutes. So here's an example of how I would do that. So what I would do is give the team the form, and I'd ask them to just take 5 minutes. And using that first column, I would say, write down everything that you know about the student in that now column. So bullet forms, as few words as possible. The space is small for a reason. Don't use full sentences. You can jump around and record information wherever. But basically just get down what you know. And it's not going to be everything, but it's going to be the highlights. And we haven't identified it as strengths or challenges just yet. But it's sort of, pulling everything off the top that we have readily available. And then I say, okay, now that you've done that, stop. Is there something about what you wrote in that first column that you would say represents a need for the student related to their education? So look at each of those lines, and if you think there's a need, put an X in that needs column. Okay, great. And then the last thing I ask them to do is decide on how to best address the need. So they don't have to generate necessarily the content at that point, although you can. I have teams that kind of, instead of the X's, they'll use text. But decide, are you going to use an accommodation, a goal, or both? And they indicate through check marks in that column what they're going to do. So you're moving through quickly. You're making quick decisions so that you get the form as complete as possible in this short amount of time. And then it's your blueprint. Then it's your scaffolding. It's you start to see, did I not put something there because I don't know it or because I didn't have enough time? Lots of times it's you really didn't have anything to put in there, and now you know you need to find out what you're going to put in there. So certainly you would go back then and supplement the information, fill in some of the gaps and make those full sentences. But basically all the pieces are there, and you can see from this chart, what I love about this is a child who has very complex needs. And yet we've only identified 4 goals that we're going to address with him, that between those and the accommodations, we're covering all of the needs that we've identified. Okay, let's see what else we have. Here actually is the same example, but with text. So this was, here you just see those check marks in the needs in the next, and here we actually identified in text what the needs were, and in the next column we used text for the accommodations, and then we put check marks where we were going to use a goal. And you can see under communication we were going to do both a goal and accommodations, which is possible. Same thing with the motor. Okay, so let's see what else we have for sample. So this is an example of a different way to apply it. You only see the first column here, and again, depending on where you are, that may be where you want to start. So this is sort of a quick description of who the child is, and then and you'll actually see this in one of your goal examples. This is the profile, and then following that are details about the goal. So this is just a simple now version of the chart. Okay, so I'd like to next show you an example of a team that I worked with that might help you to see some of the potential of using a process like this. So this team wanted help with planning their IEP, but I did not have the time to give them between my current visit and the visit for the IEP. So what I did is I gave them this chart, this exact chart, or very similar, and I told them, look, these are the instructions. See if you can use this to help generate the content for that IEP meeting. And then I took their previous IEP and I used the same chart, and I mapped their IEP into the chart. So what does that mean? I literally went through the present levels sentence by sentence, and for each sentence I took the essence of the sentence and I plugged the information into the chart where it belonged. If the information did not fit anywhere, meaning it wasn't relevant to answering these questions, which we find, I just highlighted it. So then I went on to the goals and accommodations, and I put a check mark next to the, if there was a goal or an accommodation, just to see where they had entered information. And then I went back to the team for the IEP, and they had used that new form to plan their IEP, and then I had the form applied to their old IEP. And I want to take a look first at the old version. Okay, so before, now, needs, next. Here in column 1, you're looking at the content areas, right? So this is column 2 is our now column. So this is strengths and challenges. And the reason you see colors and not text is I this was basically filled with personal information about this child, so I didn't want to use that. But I think the effect is the same by just looking at where they had information and where they did not. So what you see is anywhere there's blue, there was information. Anywhere that there isn't blue, there was nothing in the IEP present levels that I could fill in here. I did not have anything that talked about strengths or challenges in vision or hearing or whatever. There was nothing I could find that I could say, yes, this has been covered. And the same thing over here with the needs. There was nothing there. And then we get to the accommodations and the goals, and you can see we have highlighted boxes again, which means they had accommodations indicated for these particular areas. And then over here we had goals that matched some of these particular areas, okay? So I hope that this makes sense to you. One of the things you might notice is if this is our needs column and there are no needs identified, can we have accommodations and goals? So that's a trick question because we specifically said no earlier, right? So if I have not said that there's a need medically or for health, I can't use an accommodation for that because there's no reason to ostensibly, right? If I haven't identified present levels or a need with communication, why would I have accommodations and goals in that area, right? So it's logical connection. So let's take a look at the after sample. So in the after, exact same team, exact same student. All of the blue areas are areas where they had entered information by the time that I had returned. Where you see green means we were going to, in that meeting, cover that information. So they actually hadn't yet entered that, but it wasn't because they didn't have it. It was they were appropriately waiting until we had the meeting. And the orange one was not relevant. So the only area that they did not have any information in was like science, social studies, health, those types of content areas. Other than that, every area that you see blue in was an area that they had addressed. So even without the contents, you can see the difference. And I'll go to the next slide and you can see these are the two, same student, same team. The only thing that was different between the two pictures was in one, we didn't use this form to guide the content of the IEP, and in the other that we did. Look at how much more information they have included in their present levels just because they were asked, right? So they didn't complete any new assessments. They didn't do anything different. This is them sharing that information as they should in those present levels, right? Look at the needs they've identified and then gone on and addressed those needs through those accommodations. So I'm not sure how long it took them to do this. They entered this in text. It was still in bulleted form, but this is a great example of how just having this transparent format can really improve the quality of that narrative. And both of them look the same. I will tell you that on this was the same size IEP as this one. What we saw over here was a lot of yellow highlighted narrative information about, like I gave the example before, oh, he used to use PECs. That I can't put anywhere. It doesn't tell me it's a strength or a challenge or an impact. It just tells me sort of something used to be. Or raw test scores. I don't know what that means. I'm not sure what how that translates. There was just, or subjective information about how cute he was and how much we like him, and I don't know where to put that, right? That doesn't help me to plan his educational program. And here they got down to brass tacks. They really, put down the information that was needed. So think about how much easier it will be for them to now write these goals and to then plan instruction from those goals. So if you've got strengths and challenges and impacts and you know the curriculum, isn't that your roadmap right up to how do I plan for instruction? And if you don't have that, I can't imagine how you're going to plan for a literacy program if you haven't yet articulated where they are right now and where you want to go with them. So this is really, it might be a little bit more kind of detail that you articulate up front, but it pays off in spades after. And think about, which IEP would you rather get if you were receiving an IEP on a new student? Do you want this one or do you want this one? I think I know which one you'd pick, but okay, so when we know better, we do better. Again, I want to direct your attention to the handouts. Those are going to contain a lot of the information that we're going to talk about. We are going to just, in the time we have left, talk about some more qualitative ways, some of which will overlap with things that we've talked about. Others are going to be new for improving our present levels of performance narratives and our goals. So again, some are going to be required by law, and others are just good practice. What I think would be helpful is to be able to highlight those habits, and then we can practice them and improve on those quality of the present levels. So if you see in these next two slides, oh my gosh, I'm not doing a lot of those things, try not to get discouraged. Try to just think about one thing that you might start to do. If you get overwhelmed, or you get thinking that, well, even if right now you're thinking, oh my gosh, my IEP is just not looking like that, knowledge is power, and we're trying to just do a +1. So try and do one thing differently. Try and take one section. This is why I tried to offer in your action steps sort of ways to break it down, because if you get discouraged, you're really not going to make progress, and it's not an all or nothing. You know, one improvement per IEP, and in a year you're making you're doing quality IEPs across the board, right? Okay, so top 10 ways to improve the present levels of performance. The first one we've talked about back in the slide when we introduced the Now Needs Next, which is referencing the grade level general education curriculum as the starting point, not only for the content of the academics, but also for that functional performance. So talking to that gen ed teacher, finding out what they're working on, and then talking about the student skills in reference to that grade level curriculum. As we said, there is no out of level, there is no he's not ready for academics or developmental level. It's not part of our high expectations. It's not part of our practice. So if you're finding that, then try and seek out information about how other people are doing this, because it is possible and it is, necessary. Address all of the academic and foundational and functional areas, right? So picking and choosing based on what you've done before, which is what happens when we don't use the grid. We just sort of regurgitate the areas that we've been working on, but if there are areas that we should be working on that we're not, well, then they never show up in the IEP again. Or if the child comes with an IEP and someone else didn't address the area, and now you're just sort of continuing on with that, we lose sight of the breadth of those areas that we're supposed to be addressing, and they all work with each other. So really look across and recognize that those foundational skills really are the ones that they're going to impact the performance in academics. So you're going to find when you do this, it's not necessarily a discrete list of very different statements. It's different manifestations of the child's challenges. So I think you'll find it's not as overwhelming as it might think, as, oh my gosh, I'm going to end up with 20 different ideas or different comments or facts. Oftentimes they're variations on a theme. Please represent strengths and challenges, and I'll get back to that below. Interpret test scores. Raw test scores. Not only are they not meaningful in terms of strengths and challenges, etc., but they don't help us to provide instruction. So it is required that if you have test scores, that you interpret those. And if you've got a lot of testing, not all of it needs to be regurgitated in the present levels, right? So this is not an all about me section. There's specific information that's required, and lots of times we put lots of things in there that aren't required. Get them out. Remove those things, put them somewhere else, create everything you wanted to know about me, or a photo book if you want. But this is about present levels of performance and academic achievement. So If the test scores speak to that, include them, and if they don't, reference the assessment external to the IEP. Please use clear, respectful language. So again, talking about some of the ambiguous language of she's doing much better. I don't know her. I don't know relative to what is she doing better. Also, the respectful language, I had an example in here and I pulled it out, but it was from my niece's IEP, and it said something about, if she, the teachers generally agree that her spelling is due to her carelessness or being lazy. Not respectful, right? That, that's sort of, there are other ways to say that. So really look at how things are said in those IEPs, and if we're using language that, shows high expectations and respect for the person as an individual, reread that with an eye for a parent reading it and how that would sound, or another professional. Reference objective data sources. This sort of goes with what's above, but giving subjective information, like I think, or about something that should be objective is not a best practice. So try and say, where do you get that from? Based on what? So if you're saying, he's not able to read words or whatever, is that based on your expectation, or do you have some objective data that shows that you attempted that and they're not yet doing X, and so we're going to try and work on that process, okay? State all educational needs. I've sort of beat that one down. We don't need to go through. Acknowledge when you need more information. If you get to a present levels and you say, you know what, I'm really not sure how to measure the math skills of this child with significant needs, it's okay to say, this is an ongoing process and we're working on, and this is what we've done. But you got to start looking for that information, and talk to your math teacher about what are the concepts that are involved, and talk to other educators about what they're using. So don't just sort of accept that I don't really know how to test this, but acknowledge what you do know or what you are doing about that, and then continue to seek out good information. Or if you don't have good test results because the student performance was inconsistent or whatever, just say that and then continue to try and find an improvement for that. Convey high expectations. I can't tell you, I can tell you actually, I can tell you from reading a present levels what kind of goals I'm going to see. Because if I see a lot of sort of low expectation language, then I know I'm going to see a lot of developmental goals. So high expectations mean I am confident that with instruction this can change, and I think maybe we're not confident. Maybe that's why the language isn't saying that, but maybe we have to act as if. So maybe if we put confident language in, we'll feel better about it and we can move in that direction. So look and see, am I projecting that I think this is possible, that this is, I'm going to try and we're going to try and I think this can happen, or am I sort of being negative Nelly about things? And the last note about improving present levels of performance is write the IEP that you want to receive. So it goes back to that chart, which one would you rather get? Think about, if I were to receive this, does this give me good information? Do I feel confident about what I need to know about this child that I wouldn't otherwise know based on just their age and gender? Do I feel like I have just a really good picture of where to start their instruction and what their needs are? Write the IEP that you want to read, basically. Okay, so we're going to quickly go through, before we run out of time, the looking at the goals and ways that we can improve that. And basically, my experience is there are two things that we can do to positively impact the quality of goals. First is a really good present levels of performance, that if you don't have the breadth and depth of content, then you really reduce the chances that the goal content is going to be appropriate, and it's going to be more likely to be random and subjective. So you have a good present levels, you're going to generate, or at least be set up to generate, really good goals. Second thing is, I do find that providing folks with quality goal examples helps them to sort of maybe think along those same lines about how they could write a goal that looks like that. So focusing on the structure of how to write an IEP goal, it's a formula, quite honestly. And sometimes I think it kind of gets in the way, because sometimes we get caught up in all this wording, and when we strip it away, we end up with a goal that I wonder, is that really what you wanted to accomplish in a year? Because it got lost in all of this wording. So I did include examples of goals that I have written, as well as some from individuals in the field of augmentative communication and literacy, in your handouts. Do know that the ones that I wrote are written for particular children and teams and different circumstances, right? So they're not written as a goal bank or necessarily to be generally applicable. They're examples of what I think were good contributions to this child's IEP at the time, but they might help that teacher to understand what goals might look like that meet the criteria that we're going to talk about in a minute. And sometimes that can trigger that educator's own ideas about how to write goals that they want to target. So, and basically the bigger concern about goals is, if you have lousy goals, or poor goals, maybe I should say, what does that say about the associated instruction, right? So if I am not even sure what to target, what does this say about instruction? Okay, so we're going to move right into the list, and this little cartoon about, I think my test results are a pretty good indication of your abilities as a teacher, leads into the first of the top 10 ways to improve goals, which is, a goal is actually a measure of effectiveness of adult services. So lots of times I see goals that almost look like a challenge to the student, like they're going to respond to these directions and answer, and comply or whatever. And I think, does that tell me that you understand that a goal is a measure of whether the services I provided were effective? So if our services are effective, what change will we see in the student? That's what a goal answers. So a goal is not sort of a child responsibility. It's actually the results of our own instruction, and they tell us whether we've done our job or not, or whether we need to make changes in what we're doing. So I think that's critical to understand, and it's why we have that services goal connection. Is the services are connected to goals because the goals are a measure of the service, right? Okay, goals need to be connected to a needs statement. They need to be educationally relevant. Discipline-free means we don't have OT goals and PT goals and speech goals. We have one child who integrates all of those things. We need to have integrated goals. If they're not written as such, the chances of them being implemented as such are very low. So we need to think about the whole child and then address it as such, and have those goals be combined again. Otherwise, we can end up with this laundry list of goals, and then we have segregated sort of, let's pull them out and work on OT or PT or speech or whatever. And what we know is that that's not where we get our best outcomes. Start with that grade level connection. That will inform that content of the goals. We don't want to rewrite the whole curriculum. I'm not going to get into the specifics, but what we know is we want to address the areas that impede access to that curriculum, and not necessarily, not at all rewrite the curriculum. So use thoughtful, appropriate measures. Lots of times it looks like the measures are just sort of check, 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 and don't really reflect, is video the best measure? Is student product the best measure? What would we do? I like to say maximum of 7 goals. Just because you have more goals and more accommodations does not mean you're implementing them. The more you have, the more watered down your energy gets across all of them. I would want some really strong, 5 really strong goals that everyone's working toward, and that really can impact my child across the day and combine all of those needs, as opposed to 15 that are discipline specific and really don't represent integration. Think about, if the child were able to do this in 1 year, would that improve the quality of their life? I always look at a goal and say, is this a goal that represents something that I really think will help this child, or is this my agenda? So if I put myself in and say, I really want to identify a goal that's going to make your life better. And if it doesn't do that, then it might be more about me using some checklist or some developmental continuum that doesn't really reflect what would be a good outcome for that child. Focus on that content first. I try and have teams just write down in very quick form, bullet form, what do you want to work on? 1 word, 2 words. And then we can dress it up with the conditions and the criteria and the behaviors and all of that. But if you don't have that content first, then it does get lost in all of that wording, and you can end up not having the target that you intended. And then the last is combine those foundational and academic skills. So some of the goals that I've included will show you what that looks like, because that is an area that folks ask me about a lot, is how do I work on communication and academics? Don't I need separate goals for that? How do I work on vision or other foundational areas? And so I try and focus on showing them how you can combine your academic areas and basically take your foundational skill and apply it in an academic context is how I do it. So, okay. This is a restatement of what I just said about the general ed curriculum not being rewritten in the IEP. Next steps, check and see if you have evaluation tools or ways of assessing present levels for those areas in the first column, or look on some positive language examples into the present levels of performance. Use the now needs next and take each statement from your current IEP and try and put it in a box and see if you have statements that don't fit anywhere and if you have blanks that of information where you need something, or use it proactively to prepare for an upcoming IEP. Or apply that process across one area. So go from start to finish in just one area. These are just some ideas for next steps. We will take questions, but before we do, I want to say a big thank you to the Angelman Syndrome Foundation Communication Training Series. Folks that made it possible were the Angelman Syndrome Foundation and a generous grant from the Foster Family Charitable Foundation, which is a family foundation established in Central California. So thank you so much for participating, and I'll go back and we can take some questions for the live webinar.